All right, I think we've got the majority of folks, and if I talk long enough, the rest will filter in while we get started here. So we're now transitioning into the final concurrent session of the day, and then after this, I believe, is the reception in the barn. Does that sound right? Yes, reception right over here in the barn, so you'll be able to enjoy more time outside and get any refreshments that you need at that time. So right now we have Jamey Fidel and Tim Duclos, both from Vermont Audubon. Jamey Fidel is the Vice President of Vermont at the National Audubon Society. Prior to Audubon, he served as the Forest and Wildlife Program Director and General Counsel at the Vermont Natural Resource Council, where he helped shape landmark policy on wildlife habitat conservation, forest fragmentation, and land use. Jamey is the founder of the Forest Roundtable, a long-standing forum that unites diverse stakeholders to collaborate on forest policy. His early career work in Colorado focused on land, biodiversity, and watershed protection. Jamey holds a JD and master's degree in environmental law from Vermont Law School and a BA in environmental studies and a minor in wildlife biology from the University of Vermont. We also have Tim Duclos. Tim Duclos is a conservation ecologist with Audubon, Vermont, specializing in forest bird conservation and management. Born and raised in Vermont, Tim brings a lifelong connection to the land to his work, combining ecological science with practical forestry. He earned his Master's of Science from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, conducting research with the U.S. Forest Service, Northern Research Station, and U.S. Geological Service Climate Adaptation Science Center on how climate and forest dynamics shape bird communities across an area. The White Mountain National Forest. Didn't have the second part of your bio. All right, well, thank you very much, Jamey and Tim, and I'll let you take it from here.
All right, thanks, Jared. Good to see you all. It's been great to be here, inspiring number of days here, and we're excited to talk to you about some stewardship perspectives as it relates to both some work that the Forest Stewards Guild has been doing regarding old forests, and in sort of an example of a project where Audubon Vermont and Vermont Natural Resources Council, where I worked for a number of years, also in partnership with Dr. Keaton, provided some input on a project on the Green Mountain National Forest and talk about some of the measures that resulted there that relate to old forests. And so with that, let me advance this here. Just kind of quickly, some of the shared values that we have our organizations as we've been working together, just focusing on, as we think about old forest and land management, land conservation, just coming from a place of trying to center on ecological integrity for our lands, promoting the maintenance of biodiversity, thinking about climate resilience and the land ethic. You can see the missions here of the various organizations that were part of the partnership for this presentation. And recognizing that, through collaboration and adaptive thinking is key. That there's really no one size fits all to forest stewardship. If this is an adaptive model, we're consistently learning and testing out new applications and understanding the science, understanding that forest ecosystems are complex and dynamic, that we do have to think on the scale of forest time, and that we need to balance a number of competing uses and interests in our public lands, the values that we hold, and a number of factors as it relates to forest, including that we have a land use history that we've been talking about here that is hugely shaped sort of our land and forest land, and that we really value those areas that haven't been shaped by that land use impact, but the overwhelming majority of our forest lands have been impacted and are just on a recovery trajectory now, and that our management decisions need to consider that and respond to the current and future threats that our forests are facing. And we know that there are many threats that our forests are facing. just quickly, as I think about, 23 years I spent at Vermont Natural Resources Council, a lot of that work in partnership with Audubon Vermont on a number of these initiatives, that there has been a lot of attention over the years to trying to do what we can to play our part, along with a number of folks, and I see a number of them in the room who have been part of the history in Vermont of promoting old growth protection and preservation. And just some examples: the Green Mountain National Forest, when it was going through a revision process, that was during the early years when I joined VNRC, and was part of a Vermont Wilderness Association that both Audubon and VNRC and other conservation organizations were part of, where we had a vision of adding over 79,000 acres of new wilderness to the Green Mountain National Forest. What ended up resulting was the New England Wilderness Act of 2006. Over 41,000 acres were designated as wilderness in Vermont. And I know before somebody mentioned, that there was the Joseph Patel Wilderness created, and as part of that effort, 12,333 acres were added to the Patel Wilderness. And then also close to here, we had additions of over 3,700 acres added to the Loaf Wilderness. And then there's been state land designations that we've supported, like the West Mountain Wildlife Management Core Area. If you were in the room previously, Representative Sheldon talked about some of the improvements to current use. Before the reserve forest land category, that's a more recent category to allow for wild forest management and current use, there was the creation of ecologically significant treatment areas, and that was a big campaign that came out of a forest roundtable effort that I helped to convene with a lot of partners, which led to improving the current use program to have areas that didn't have to be actively managed, still management considerations, but these were areas that had ecological significance, and this includes old forest, where there could be a different management approach, a passive management approach for those areas. And then I brought copies of this old growth publication that VNRC partnered with. Mark Lappin wrote this. It's sort of vintage now. This came out in 2005. But I was able to find some of the last remaining copies at the VNRC office, and thought, what better place than to bring the last remaining copies here. So if you don't have a copy, please feel free to grab one. And also QR codes here, it's online on the VNRC website. This was a great literature review that Mark did on the characteristics of old growth in eastern North American forests, and really proud of this publication. So I wanted to present just some of the, let you know what the Forest Steward Guild and some things that they've been approaching more recently in relation to old forests. They have an old forest policy recognizing that few areas of old forest remain, that old forests are under threat, and there's a need for a nuanced view that acknowledges there's a role for both passive and active management as we think about stewardship and restoration options when it comes to promoting old forests. There is a position statement that I think is quite excellent that the Guild has recently put out. Again, QR code here. It won't take you very long to read it. It's really well written. And they wrote this as a response to the conversations that were happening at the national level during the Biden administration with an executive order related to mature and old forests. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. But please do read this if you're interested in seeing how the Guild is approaching this. And they really, in this statement, emphasize the importance of old forests and trees, talk about the values and functions of old trees, talks about and acknowledges the stressors and threats to old forests, discusses stewardship options to protect old forests, and promote old forest conditions. And I think what you'll find is that for the Guild, they focus that not necessarily a binary choice, that there is preservation, which the Guild strongly supports, and then there's sort of a range of potential actions that can intentionally try and promote resilience and robust forest functions, but that they do support excluding old growth from management, except where there would be some kind of restoration needed to maintain conditions, guide younger forests towards old growth conditions, retain large old trees and down logs to accelerate structural complexity, and management can help offset global old growth loss, though not everywhere. So there's some of the principles that the Guild has on these issues. And then a lot of those sort of resonate with an approach that we took collectively. And as I mentioned, Dr. Keaton was part of this work as we thought about how best to provide input to both the National Old Growth Amendment process that was happening that the Biden administration had. I'm not going to review all the words here. The reason there's so many words here is I think it's just helpful to see what was part of this process. This was, a nationwide direction for conserving existing and recruiting future old growth forests. There was a pilot effort to establish regional criteria, which was coarsely screened for potential old growth stands. Some of that was identified in our region, Region 9. And then there was a tension through this process that ultimately what would need to happen is that at the national forest level, at the local level, there would need to be a process to come up with a working definition for old growth and mature forest. And then there would need to be a local process that would get to an understanding about what would be the preservation or management options in order to maintain and restore both mature and old forest. And so unfortunately, when this effort was withdrawn in the change of the administration, Chief Randy Moore put out a letter to all the national forests, still underscoring the importance of the effort, that a lot of the information is still relevant. And the main take-home point in that letter was encouraging individual national forests to still do their best to try and take a run at figuring out what would that local criteria look like. And that was really the essence of what we tried to do in the Telephone Gap project, and also in providing some input to the National Forest Service through the National Old Growth Amendment process. And some of the principles that we settled on was trying to implement a triad approach for multiple use landscapes that would have protection of key areas, especially old growth, restoration or improvement of old forest conditions, and then supporting sustainable forest management. And some of the principles here, or protecting what remains, existing old growth, must not be degraded. Passive stewardship, best for forests, can naturally sustain resilience and high quality habitat. That there can be an active management, approach to accelerate recruitment of old growth traits in appropriate areas, have a science-driven and site-specific process, consider climate and biodiversity resilience, and have some incidental or limit exceptions to this, and trying to stay core and also consider indigenous uses and thinking through the process. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim in just a second here to talk about how we put our best foot forward in trying to influence the Forest Service with some thinking about a different approach to forest management. I do want to acknowledge that when it comes to public land, that there's going to be obviously in a healthy range of opinions on how to manage public lands, and that there's going to be a lot of passionate thinking that I think for many of us, if not all of us in the room, we feel really deeply and passionately about public lands are important to us. We show up with a lot of values about how they should be managed. And there should be a robust debate about how public lands are managed. And people should show up with their best information, the best science that they have, the best ideas they have for our public land managers. And in our case, we tried to show up in a collaborative posture as possible with the Forest Service, knowing that if we want to implement some aspect of the National Old Growth Amendment and have it be successful with the Forest Service, that we needed to have it be science-based, something that would be credible enough for them to implement. And we wanted to see if we could get traction in trying out a different model. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim to run through more of the mechanics of the Telephone Gap project.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jamey.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There was one other point I just wanted to make. Sorry. Sorry, bad of me, Tim.
You're good. You're the big boss now. So.
No, I just want to say that for those who remember sort of the process that happened with the revision of the forest plan and the wilderness designations, it was a difficult, very heated process. It was not easy. The wilderness designations were not easy to secure, and there was a lot of fracturing that happened in the forest community about the debate around that plan. But generally, as I recall, when the wilderness designation happened and the final forest plan came out, there seemed to be general agreement that the forest plan was, in Jim Northup, if he was here, was a big part of that process, was that the forest plan was actually a fairly solid plan. And there was no litigation against the plan at that time, thinking this is a plan that could be implemented. And so the last thing I just wanted to say is I know that as we were thinking about the implementation of the telephone gap project, we were thinking of in the context that it was within areas that were designated on the forest for active management. So how can we then show up and put our best foot forward, realizing that these were the areas that were zoned, if you will, where there was going to be an active management approach. Okay, thanks, Tim.
Got it. Cool. So I'm going to talk about telephone gap. Pretty hot issue. To begin, before I get into the details of the project, I would be remiss not to say that, I grew up in Middlebury, was born here. I was very much inspired by these mountains and the long trail that runs through the state of Vermont, through the telephone gap area to do what I do. And, long story short, that led to my master's, working with the U.S. Forest Service and the USGS Climate Adaptation Science Center, where I spent the summers hiking through the White Mountain National Forest, counting birds, measuring temperature, precipitation, measuring forests, and really, getting to study how forests and climate are really important factors in determining birds and the wellness of birds on the forested landscape in the national forest. And to be honest, when I finished up with my master's, I was a bit bummed at the thought that, wow, I did all this academic research, I published a paper, but how am I going to apply this? How am I going to really make a difference? And I feel so fortunate to have come back to Vermont and to have worked at some great organizations and now found myself at Audubon, Vermont, and getting to lead, in part, a movement to advance ecological forestry and thinking about birds as the indicator and the motivator of good stewardship across the landscape. And this project kind of fell into my lap, I'd say. Jamey came to us and has been working with Audubon for a long time and took this project on. And so telephone gap, it's a 72,000 acre project area that largely is north of Rutland. And so it spans the towns of Brandon, Chittenden, Goshen, Killington, Mendon, Pittsfield, Pittsford, and Stockbridge. Chittenden Reservoir, if anybody's camped there, one of the last places in Vermont, you can just show up on a Friday and go camping, which is amazing. Camped there twice this summer. This large area encompasses the project, right? I should say that is so much more than the national forest lands that we're actually talking about when we're thinking about management, right? So this is like lands far beyond just the national forest. The national forest only has about half the acreage here represented by that. And so here we're thinking about proposed management as part of the 2006 Green Mountain National Forest Plan. And specifically among the suite of activities and stewardship efforts proposed in the plan, our work really focused on the timber aspects. So thinking about the management of about 12,000 stand acres. And so when we say stand acres, that describes kind of the geography surrounding and including these forest units where some type of timber management might happen. And so that's so much larger than the specific treatments that were and are currently proposed. When we looked at those treatments, and by we, it was myself, Jamey, Dr. Keaton, others at Audubon. These were more intensive treatments. They're kind of more, let's say, traditional U.S. Forest Service treatments and just silvicultural treatments. A little bit more heavy-handed, you might say, across the area. Some of the stands did include ages, or I should say, were associated with an age of origin 150 years, if not older. And that may just represent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 trees measured as 150 years old within that stand. So there's a little bit of flexibility in how age is actually determined. As a part of that, before we even got to, or I should say the Forest Service got down to those 12,000 acres, they worked with the state of Vermont to identify true old growth forests, according to the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources definition, and they identified 1,000 acres that was outside of the project area and never included as part of these proposed treatments. And so looking at the proposed treatments and thinking about especially the public discourse and the dialogue about what was proposed there and what it was going to mean for the ecosystem, we saw an opportunity to comment and potentially influence what the Forest Service was going to do. And so, especially with the guidance of Dr. Keaton, we proposed to the Forest Service that they reevaluate all of these stands, looking at the actual inventory data gathered within these stands, and take those data and run them through a series of analyses that Dr. Keaton and others have developed with which to identify late seral characteristics. So looking at structural diversity of the stand from data gathered, measured within these stands themselves, looking at the biological diversity and richness, so the Shannon Diversity Index here. Any ecologist, biologist folks in the room know like the Shannon Weiner Diversity Index, so that's species diversity, the richness of those species as well as snag biomass. So these are standards by which old forest research has been looking at old growth characteristics. And from that, we propose that they apply a triad approach whereby stands identified to have superior levels of structural and species diversity, snag biomass, old growth characteristics be excluded from management. So that's one part of the triad. From there, in that same analysis, there were stands identified to be on the cusp of developing those old forest characteristics. And those were areas where we felt that perhaps they could do more ecological forestry to kind of move things along more gently, less intensive forestry, but kind of just enhance those old forest characteristics so as to recruit into these older forest stands. And then from there, the third part of the triad would be stands that didn't even come close. They didn't really have the level of structural diversity, species diversity, snag biomass that really exemplify old forest characteristics. And those would be places where perhaps more intensive management could still happen. And incredibly enough, the Forest Service put out several alternatives as part of this, and one of them absolutely honored this request, right? They reran their analyses of the inventory data according to our request, and they identified 814 stand acres, or 661 treatment acres of forest that that do exhibit higher levels of structural species diversity, snag biomass that would otherwise have been missed during other analyses. And those stands were designated as Category 1, deferred management. Right, so that's not permanent protection, but we're not going to go in there and do any management except for very unique cases of hazard tree removal, invasive plant management. So hands off. And then they identified among the other stands proposed for management 3,600 stand acres in which, the forest was on the edge of developing these characteristics. And there they applied a suite of ecological forestry treatments that have been researched and identified as being compatible with efforts to advance the development of forests towards late seral characteristics without overly impacting the developmental trajectory of those stands. And then, as I had already mentioned, other stands not really exhibiting much ecological complexity compared to others still were allocated towards more commercial management. Compared to Alternative B, which was the original proposal, almost all of these, or I should say all of these stands were largely going to be more intensely managed, maybe towards, let's say, category 3. And under the new alternative, half of what was proposed minus these 800 plus stands that are going to be deferred from management, half of them are now going to be managed according to ecological forestry principles. And that was not the case before. And that's very precedent setting. And there's more. So in addition to that novel approach to managing these forests, for all stands identified as category 2, late seral enhancement, when they go out, they being the Forest Service, to potentially mark trees, consider actually going into those stands, they're going to re-inventory those stands, again in the field, according to Dr. Keaton and Tony D'Amato's Old Forest Characteristics Guidelines and benchmarks that they've established for this part of the world. And if they find any of those stands exhibiting those characteristics, they're also going to defer management. They're not going to do anything in there. They're also going to go back and they're going to look at any stands that are older than 150 years old currently. And they're going to go out and reevaluate to identify whether or not they should be visited by the state of Vermont and designated as state old growth forest or state designated for old growth forest protection, right? So basically going back and validating, verifying whether or not they truly are stands that are representative of 150 years and older. Additionally, across all management that they do, any trees that are with a high prior probability of being 150 years or older, they're going to designate those as legacy trees and not touch them. Right? So in effect, what this should result in, what I have tremendous faith will come of this, is that any stands 150 years and older will not be touched. Any stands that exhibit old forest characteristics won't be touched. Any state designated or state definable old growth stands won't be touched, and any trees 150 years and older won't be touched. We've seen this publication, and you can't promote it enough. This is what they're going to apply when they go out and evaluate these stands before they do anything else. Looking for the existence of trees, number of live trees greater than 12 inches diameter at breast height and larger, greater than 16 inches. Excuse me, about numbers really slightly dyslexic. So basically looking at the number of large trees, dead trees, and down woody material in the woods, right? So like these quantifiable benchmarks by which they can go out and actually look and quantifiably identify whether or not these stands exhibit these characteristics. So at the risk of repeating myself, again, any stands that are across all of these efforts identified to have an age of origin 150 years or greater will be excluded from management. They're going to measure this on the ground. They're going to look at functional characteristics of old growth on the ground and not enter stands that exhibit those characteristics. 150-year-old trees will be protected as part of this. They're going to apply, at a scale we haven't seen before, a suite of treatments to accelerate old forest characteristics. All of this work is totally in alignment with Principles of Managing for Climate Resilience in Bird Habitat. My advisor, Dr. Dave King, has done a lot of research in the White Mountains and the Green Mountains within these treatment areas, looking at the various silvicultural treatments and the benefit of birds. And I can tell you that the birds love active management in these cases. Young forests, we are missing young forests on this landscape, and there are plantations that will there will be some young forest creation in that Category 3. In those Category 3 areas, those are largely going to be really degraded stands or plantations where they're already monocultures. They don't really offer a whole lot ecologically. And as I already mentioned, old growth stands have already been identified by the state and excluded, and there's going to be additional safeguards in place to involve the state in potentially identifying new old growth stands. So as I wrap up here, broadly, as we've heard so much about at this awesome conference, birds, ecosystems, we need functional, diverse forests now, especially in Vermont, right? We cut all of our forests down. We don't really have primary growth forests anymore, largely second growth forests. We are dealing with a climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and in many cases, there's an opportunity to undertake forestry so as to restore those lost forest conditions and accelerate their development, right? But it's not a one-size-fits-all approach to forest management. We need a balanced approach, balance between passive management, where conditions are not conducive for active management. Conditions are already great for birds and greater ecosystem health, but there are opportunities to undertake some active management. Public policies, public discourse are rapidly changing. It's been, I feel, kind of uniquely privileged to be doing what I'm doing at my point in my career and be entering this conversation. I think the opportunity to advance the principles of ecological silviculture and help landowners and practitioners think about how we steward lands as an ecosystem is so relevant. And this project, in addition to just the simple fact of helping the Forest Service, apply some novel approaches, in addition to that, I really felt like this case really it is almost just as much about public perception of forest management, right? Because this situation or this telephone gap itself really ignited a conversation about what is old growth forest, what is forest management, what does logging look like, should I log my land, I do landowner technical assistance as part of my work, and more the conversations are about is logging okay, is forest management okay. And that totally plays into my work with training foresters, working with natural resource practitioners to try to encourage more ecologically focused forestry and to validate good management where it's prescribed, and to really help the public see that there are opportunities to undertake good management in the forest. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach to forest management. Forest complexity, forest dynamics, it's really complex, it's really nuanced, and it is so easy to say that, these forests are old growth forests, we shouldn't touch them, we should leave them alone, and it's so much harder to explain the unique history of Vermont's forest and the polycrisis, that's a term I heard yesterday, I had to look it up, and it's true, we're dealing with a polycrisis, like trying to explain the dynamics of forest ecology, forest management, and how to kind of thread the needle on these issues is really, really challenging. And we're all trying our best to advance good science, engage the public as active stewards in this issue. And I think we all need to continue to work together, and to do so in a civil way. We need to be careful to not disparage and slander each other because that really stands to undermine all of our work, right? We live in an age where, you know, science is being discredited on one side, and it's almost in this issue, science is being discredited on another side. And it's, you know, the public, all of us are more and more wondering, like, what is the truth? And I and all the people I work with are doing the best to bring the truth and to try to see this as a balanced issue and see it as something that's workable, right? It's all workable. So with that, I'll leave you with some QR codes to check out our comments, and I'll take some questions. Yeah.